If the 43 million who are the immediate beneficiaries of the Great Lakes waters don't understand how important it is for us to assume our responsibility, if we can't protect this water, not only for ourselves, but future generations, who else will? If we don't protect this water, we're going to compromise our quality of life, and we're going to compromise our ability to generate prosperity. It's up to the 43 million. It's their water. It's their future. It's their quality of life that is at stake here. It's a matter of the 43 million people saying, this is important to us. We want it done, and we won't suffer any opposition. Dalton McGuinty, Premier of Ontario, December 2005.
If you look at national polls, when you ask people across the country what are they concerned about in terms of environmental issues, the top 4 concerns all deal with water quality and water quantity. So this is not just an issue we're dealing with here in this region, it's dealt with all over. It's important to people.
Water is the most important resource on our planet. It's necessary for life itself. Each person needs a minimum every day just to survive. Industries, too, need water to generate power, to manufacture products, and then ship those goods. Fresh water is not a luxury commodity. It's an essential part of our health and happiness.
You know, I read an interesting quote yesterday. A fellow who has lived in this area for, over 20 years or so, and said, humans are made 97% water or something to that effect. I've been drinking Lake Michigan water for 25 years, which I have too. He says, I really am Lake Michigan.
The ability to protect our water resources, and specifically the Great Lakes, depends on both the natural processes that dictate the flow of water into the lakes and the way our populations use our water resources. At this time, the 8 states and 2 Canadian provinces that border the lakes are working to protect these waters now and into the future through the Great Lakes Compact Agreement.
When you're looking at the current legislation that's under debate, for example, the compact language, that's really an attempt to do holistic ecosystem management, to look at this environment, this system as a system, instead of looking at it as a bunch of little different pieces of a pie. So this is an important thing. This has never been tried before. And it's something that the Great Lakes region can lead, I think, the nation and the world in developing this sort of agreement. I think it's extremely important.
How can one manage the waters of an ecosystem as big as the Great Lakes? To best protect our water, we need to understand how it gets to the lakes, how much is used by the ecosystem and by people, and what other water resources we depend on currently. The Great Lakes were formed thousands of years ago from the melting glaciers. Together, they're the largest source of liquid fresh water on the Earth's surface. Each lake has its own characteristics, from shallow Lake Erie to deep Lake Superior, which holds 3.2 quadrillion gallons of water. enough to contain all of the other Great Lakes, plus 3 additional Lake Eries.
My favorite statistic about the Great Lakes is that because of the residence time of the water in the Great Lakes, and especially Lake Superior, if you drink a glass of water from Lake Superior today, roughly 20% of the water in that glass, at least from a statistical standpoint, was here before Columbus landed on a lost Caribbean island. So we're talking about ancient water and glacial water, and a lot of people don't tend to think of the Great Lakes as being that old and the water as having that much residency.
The Great Lakes are 94,000 square miles along the border between Canada and the U.S. Actually, they are freshwater oceans. People are often surprised at their size. If you include the land surface that drains to the lakes, it's really impressive. The Great Lakes Basin covers over 295,000 square miles, more area than the state of Texas. The basin is the area from which rain and snowmelt drains to the lakes after flowing over land or through rivers and streams. Also known as a watershed, a basin is determined by the topography of the land surface.
The streams in the watershed throughout the Great Lakes region are really the arteries of the Great Lakes system. They feed fresh water and new water into the Great Lakes every time it rains and snows and as gravity pulls it downhill. We know that the tributaries contribute, along with the precipitation, maybe 1% of the volume of the Great Lakes in a given year, and roughly 1% of the volume of the Great Lakes goes over the falls, through Lake Ontario, and down into the Seaway.
Well, the primary influx to the lake is by rain, of course, direct precipitation, and by streams delivering precipitation that landed in the basin, but not on the lake itself. There's a certain amount also that comes in from the groundwater, probably quite small. The primary fluxes out are evaporation and the actual amount of water that exits out the St. Lawrence Seaway. The fluxes of material through the lake are important, not just the fact that they're very large, but that there's a large flux and that any changes that we're making to this flux are getting right at the underlying behavior and ecology of the lake. And the idea that it's just a big puddle of water there, what harm can we do to it, is probably a false impression.
Each lake has a unique shape, and that affects its behavior and ecology. Water in Lake Erie takes 3 years on average to pass through to Lake Ontario. On the other hand, Lake Superior has a residency time of 190 years, one of the longest in the world. Water flows into each of the lakes from the surrounding basin at different rates as well.
Within the Great Lakes states, there's a natural drainage basin. We know where the subcontinental divide is, the boundaries of the Great Lakes Basin, which separate it from the other major watersheds of the United States, the Mississippi Basin being the other primary one in this area. So water's either going one way or it's going the other. And where we are here in Milwaukee, that water drains to Lake Michigan. And similarly in the other states, there's a basin, there's a subcontinental divide, and all those waters flow into the Great Lakes and then ultimately through the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Atlantic Ocean.
From the Rockies to the Appalachian Mountains, the Mississippi River receives water through all the seasons from over 1.2 million square miles. The Great Lakes are fed by a region only 1/6 as large. Because of this limited area of influx, water levels in the lakes are highly sensitive to the amount of precipitation that falls over the surrounding watershed.
A watershed is an area to which all of the water drains to a common point. In the case of a river, it's the valley to which all of the surface runoff goes, and then it enters the river and drains to the river outlet.
The Great Lakes may seem like an unending supply of water, but because of the constrained landscape that drains to the lakes, the amount of water replenished is limited. How we use this water will be important. We use lake water directly for washing clothes, cars, and ourselves. We irrigate crops, water our lawns, and generate electricity with it. And we drink it.
One estimate that I've seen is about 2 million people live within the Great Lakes Basin and are served by a public water utility. That number varies a little bit, of course, and there's many more that are on a private well. But there are 50 different water utilities that obtain their water from the Great Lakes.
People living within the Great Lakes Basin who consume lake water usually treat the water and return it back to the lake either directly or through river systems that drain to the lake. This returns a portion of the water back to the ecosystem. Some people outside the basin rely on lakes and rivers, and this surface water is what most people think of when we talk about water sources. But many people depend solely on groundwater.
We've oversold how much water is in the Great Lakes. We constantly are claiming that 20 to 50% of the world's fresh water is in the Great Lakes. That simply isn't true. 20% of the world's fresh surface water is in the Great Lakes, but 95% of the world's fresh water is in groundwater. So we have to get people to understand that they have other sources of water than the Great Lakes.
Managing our groundwater resources is just as important as protecting our surface water. It can be hard to picture this underground water, which makes it difficult to understand where it comes from and where it goes. Surface water trickles down through the tiny spaces in between the dirt and rocks and collects in underground reservoirs known as aquifers.
I think a lot of people think of an aquifer as if it's an underground river, and that's a bad thing to think of. A better analogy would be one of those big car wash sponges that you got. If you pour water in one of those sponges, it just soaks right in there and fills it up. But yet the smallest little disturbance and you can get water out of that. So you should sort of view aquifers as a large sponge with the water moving through the interstitial spaces between the grains.
Aquifers exist all over the world, and many areas depend on them instead of using surface water. In Wisconsin alone, there is 1.2 quadrillion gallons of groundwater, nearly as much as in Lake Michigan. Just as with surface watersheds, each aquifer is fed by water from a certain section of land.
A surface water basin is determined by the lay of the land, by the topography. If the ground is sloping toward a stream or a pond or a lake, that's where the water runs off, and that defines the surface water basin. The groundwater basin is determined by where the groundwater enters at the land surface, trickles down to the water table, and then it moves through the rock and through the sand to typically to surface water bodies, lakes, streams, even Lake Michigan, but also to wells.
Okay, well, I suppose we could go back to our car wash sponge and drill a hole in it and stick a straw in there. And so now if you start sucking on the straw, of course, you're going to begin to draw down the water that was being held in that sponge. Now, you run across a balance between how much rainwater is recharging that aquifer and how much you're pumping out.
Groundwater enters the system as what we call recharge, and that comes from snow and rain that trickles down. And under natural systems, that groundwater is destined to discharge at surface water bodies. So there's an intimate connection between groundwater and surface water. In fact, at the U.S. Geological Survey, we are fond of saying that it's a single resource, groundwater and surface water.
if we're pulling water out of an aquifer with wells, then it has to be replaced from somewhere. Some of the replacement will come from recharge, but generally that doesn't change in response to pumping. It's kind of fixed. So the replenishment is typically going to come from diversion of water that normally would have discharged to surface water bodies. So the base flow in streams and wetlands and lakes is going to be diminished.
But no matter how much you pump out, that was pumped out than before. So the first and most noticeable thing is that the water levels tend to go down. And so if you overpump an aquifer to a large extent, then the water table gets lower right around your well, and it extends outwards in a sort of a cone shape. And so a large cone of depression, such as we see here in southeast Wisconsin, is something like 700 feet deep and extends throughout the whole region.
The interaction of groundwater and surface water and its impact on land use planning has made the southeastern Wisconsin region an important area to study.
In the last few years, we've prepared a groundwater model for southeast Wisconsin, and this model's been prepared by the two agencies in Wisconsin that deal with groundwater. One is a federal agency, the United States Geological Survey, for which I work, and the other is our sister state agency, the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey. And we worked on this model together. We collaborated 50-50. So we start with conditions before there were wells, and then we try to, what we say, simulate. We try to reproduce the conditions through time from, it turned out, 1864 when the first wells went in until the beginning of the 21st century.
Under southeast Wisconsin, there's a horizontal layer of impermeable shale that confines the deep aquifer, allowing recharge to come only from far western Waukesha County or beyond. In the shallow, unconfined aquifer, groundwater moves relatively rapidly. After a few weeks or months, maybe a year, it trickles into a spring or stream and then flows either through the Mississippi Basin or into Lake Michigan. The small fraction of water that soaks all the way down into the deep aquifer will take thousands of years or longer to travel several miles from where it entered at the surface.
Once we recognized that deep aquifer was such a wonderful source of water, we started putting lots of wells into it. And when the first wells went in, they were in the downtown Milwaukee area. They were artesian. There was enough pressure in that aquifer that the water level would rise a couple of 100 feet above the ground surface. So we put more wells in and more wells in, and they can be pumped at 1 million to 1.5 million gallons a day. They're huge producers. But what that does is create this cone of depression, and if we've got 300-400 such wells in this aquifer, the cones of depression from all of those wells kind of coalesce into one big cone of depression. We have now lowered the water level in the deep aquifer, the sandstone aquifer, close to 500 feet since we began pumping it.
Well, southeastern Wisconsin is one area of the state where the groundwater table has been declining over the past 50 to 100 years, mostly as the region's population has grown and there's been more of a demand for water supply. One of the corollaries to that declining water supply is that as you dig deeper to drill new wells, you find water that is maybe more contaminated with radium and provides a public health concern. And so while there's groundwater there and it's available, it takes more money to treat it, more money to pump it, and there is a long-term concern about the sustainability of that groundwater system and the rate that the water is being withdrawn.
The possibility of changing water levels, whether up or down, has seldom been considered when planning human development.
Well, of course, population growth is the thing that is driving global water resource consumption right now, and that's true on a regional basis as well. More people, you need more water. It's just that simple. And that just means we have to be more careful about how we use this. Not that we just tell people they can't have water. It's that we need to be able to, if we use it, we need to treat it and put it back in the system in a clean fashion.
Once upon a time, it seemed as if our water supplies were bottomless and would last forever. And when they didn't, we simply piped more water in from somewhere else.
Historically, at least in this country, as we've developed, when an enclave of people got together, formed a city, and that city, first of all, was usually built on a surface water body. We would use that as our water source to begin with, and then we'd dirty it up to the point where it wasn't safe to use anymore. So we'd go looking for another nearby source of water, and we would transport that in. It's a process I call interbasin transfer. We'll take it from a location where it's present and bring it to where we need it. And through the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, this was our approach. If we don't have enough good quality water here, we'll go take it from someplace else.
The Great Lakes, as big as they are, have often looked like the ultimate unending someplace else when more water is needed. The most famous case is the construction of the Chicago Sanitary Canal.
Earlier in the century, there was an outbreak, a disease in the city of Chicago, and they found the reason for that outbreak was the sewer canal that was adjacent to the city of Chicago. So their answer to that was to basically reverse the flow in the sanitary sewer canal and flush all that out and send it down the Mississippi River.
For years, the Chicago River flowed into Lake Michigan, carrying with it the city's trash. But a massive engineering project reversed the flow, sending the trash and the water out of the lake and into the Mississippi River. The other states, fearing the impact of this diversion on the water levels, sued the state of Illinois several times.
Chicago, by Supreme Court decree, has a diversion. They are able to divert 3,200 cubic feet per second from the Great Lakes through the Chicago Sanitary Canal, ultimately getting to the Mississippi River. So every day they divert 3,200 cubic feet per second.
A diversion is any process that transfers water from one basin to another. The Chicago diversion removes water from Lake Michigan and puts it into the Mississippi River watershed. The large volume of fresh water in the Great Lakes has made them appear to be an attractive option for communities outside the basin who are seeking new water sources. There is debate about the overall impact on the Great Lakes and how diversions can affect the water level and ecology of the lakes.
People have done some calculations and have come up with the idea that that diversion out in Chicago has in effect lowered the lake level something like 2.5 inches. And while that may not be a big problem, the thing to think about is that many people have their eyes on this Great Lakes water.
There's a lot of interest in the Great Lakes because of pressures on lack of water, lack of appropriate or clean water sources throughout the United States. And we're seeing now different communities raising the possibility of tapping into the Great Lakes and bringing the water down to serve interests. And one example is Alabama, where there's been some discussion about serving the growth around Birmingham, Alabama, where it's having water shortage problems. We've also seen it out west, and more recently in the presidential campaign.
Well, I think it's an issue for the entire country. I mean, the Great Lakes are an incredible national, international resource, and people from around the world are going to be looking at this incredible body of fresh water that we have as the world gets thirstier and more populous. And the search for fresh water is going to be one of the great defining issues of the 21st century.
There have been serious suggestions by academics and politicians as far away as Alabama and the southwest of our country already for this water. And if you take one diversion that lowers it 2 inches, it doesn't take long before you're going to be lowering the Great Lakes by feet, several feet of water. The end member, the worst example of this sort of thing going on in the world, of course, is the Aral Sea, that in a space of something like 50 years is more or less dried up because of this very thing, diverting water out of what seems like an inexhaustibly large supply. But that isn't true. This is a system that's very large, but it's a delicately balanced system, and we have to be careful.
Requests to tap into the Great Lakes have been made throughout the 20th century. Some diversions have been allowed and others not. Most requests for water have been from towns that are close to the lakes but lie outside the watershed boundary. Some requests have come from much farther away. The latest example is Waukesha, Wisconsin, where the county straddles a divide, one part in the Lake Michigan Basin and one part draining to the Mississippi.
Here in southeastern Wisconsin, where we have communities to the west of the subcontinental divide that are using groundwater, the groundwater can't support as big a population density as Lake Michigan can. So communities to the west of the divide are clamoring to bring water from the lake out into Waukesha County to use it there.
The city of Waukesha implemented a comprehensive water supply study in early 2002. And it was completed in 2002, 2003. And it looked at a number of different options with providing the city of Waukesha with water. A couple of those options were looking east at the Great Lakes, at Lake Michigan, or looking west, further west when we get outside of that shale area where there's not the confining unit, where we can use groundwater where there's an available recharge to supply or to support the amount of water that's available for the city of Waukesha. We also looked at getting water from the Fox River. We looked at damming up the Fox River and creating more of a reservoir. But what happens is, for some of those other options that we looked at, during drought years, there was a problem with supplying water for the city of Waukesha. And there would also be a huge impact on the environmental resources if we started using those. So what Waukesha looked at was the cost, the impact to the environment, and came up with solutions that we could look at for our long-term water supply. And the two that bubbled up to the top through the study were going east to Lake Michigan or going west to developing a western well supply.
How do we determine who is allowed to take water from the Great Lakes? Who regulates diversions of Great Lakes water? There are currently very few protections in place.
Right now, there's a federal law that deals with diversions out of the Great Lakes Basin, but it's pretty vague, and the legality of it is questionable. Right now, it's subject to a couple of court challenges, so we need to have something that's a lot stronger, that has a firmer foundation, that will protect our Great Lakes for years to come and won't be subject to the whims of Congress or to a court decision.
Well, there's a whole host of different arrangements, laws, institutions, programs that really drive how the waters are used, how they're managed. In fact, that's one of the big problems right now, is that there's just this myriad of different institutions, organizations, laws, and they're not consistent. They're not uniform. They're not uniform within Wisconsin. They're not uniform across the Great Lakes Basin with all the different states and then the Canadian provinces. The Great Lakes Compact is really an arrangement of that will formally put in place how the Great Lakes states, the 8 Great Lakes states and the 2 Canadian provinces, want to move forward in managing the Great Lakes waters.
The biggest item in the compact is the provisions dealing with diversions out of the Great Lakes Basin. In other words, if a community wants to take water from outside of the natural water basin of the Great Lakes, there are certain steps they have to follow, and there are real strong prohibitions from going a certain distance beyond the borders of any Great Lake. The compact uses the subcontinental divide between the Great Lakes Basin and areas outside of the Great Lakes Basin as the boundary between inside the basin and outside the basin for purposes of the compact. It goes a step further and says if a county has communities both inside the basin and outside the basin, then you're within the decision-making framework of the compact. If a county's boundaries lie entirely outside of the Great Lakes Basin, and then they are no longer eligible for Great Lakes water under any circumstances.
Where it would have an impact in southeastern Wisconsin, though, is the exceptions to the diversion. There are two exceptions to the diversion standard. One is communities in a straddling county, and the other is straddling communities. Waukesha is a community in a straddling county, which is one of the exceptions that's allowed underneath the compact. And we would be looking at potentially ways that we could pull the water from the Great Lakes, return it to the basin, and then implement conservation measures as one of the options for providing water to the residents.
The Great Lakes Compact, however, is not a comprehensive water management program. It's meant to regulate surface water withdrawals from the lakes. The complicated issue of the relationship between groundwater and surface water has only begun to be discussed.
Historically, the Great Lakes states, and Wisconsin included in that, have developed a set of laws, regulations, practices around surface water. They more or less left the groundwater issues aside. And it's only more recently that we've begun to appreciate the pressures that are being put on the groundwater table and how those waters are being used. But in point of fact, in the natural world, they're connected. We have pretended as if they weren't connected. What we're doing is trying to catch up with the science now in the legal policy arena. And that's what part of what the Great Lakes Compact is about, is trying to marry up management programs with where the science is.
The Compact Agreement plays an important role in protecting the Great Lakes. It addresses the water supply of the lakes across state and international boundaries. Within this legislation, the natural watershed of the lakes becomes part of a legal framework for water use policies.
I think what people should know about the Great Lakes Compact Agreement is that this is an agreement that the 8 Great Lakes governors got together, and our governor, Jim Doyle, was one of the leaders in this issue, to try to come up with a way to manage this system as a system, together as a group, and do it so that we can preserve it for the future. And that's what it's really all about. It's not about whether some community on the other side of the divide can get water or not. It's really about how we sustain this system.
Well, you know, the Great Lakes are, as I said, a living system and a fragile system. And they are also a system that, from the human and social standpoint, is carved up among dozens, if not hundreds, of jurisdictions from the federal level, the binational level with Canada, the tribal jurisdictions, state, local government, county government, township level. And so at all those layers of complexity, we need leadership and commitment to conservation programs that will protect the lakes. Some actions are best done at the federal level, some at the local and community level. I think every jurisdiction has a role to play in Great Lakes protection, and we can't assume that someone else somewhere else must be taking care of this because it's so important. And it's complicated. How do you work across state and local boundaries? How do you work across international boundaries? How do you engage with the sovereign rights of the tribes? It's complicated.
Diversions of Great Lakes water have the potential for wide-reaching impact. They may affect the ecology of the lakes, shipping capacities, and our drinking water supplies. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of the citizens of these Great Lakes states, these great water states, to determine how the compact, once ratified, will be put into practice in each state.
The key next steps are that each state will pass the compact, that then it would be forwarded to U.S. Congress, and that hopefully it would be ratified by the U.S. Congress. That's when the compact itself actually takes effect, and where it is an interstate compact, and it has the backing of not only the individual states, but the federal government.
In order for the compact to become a law, or to become a compact, all 8 Great Lakes states have to pass it, the same verbiage, and then it has to be passed by Congress in order to become into effect.
Wisconsinites have a very deep and strong feeling about the waters of their state. And I think as this becomes more public, as they understand that the issues and what's at stake, the public is going to get involved, and we think that would be a good thing, because I think they want to protect the Great Lakes. They want the Great Lakes there for their children and grandchildren. So the more that they get engaged, the more that they get involved, and that they bring appropriate pressure on their legislators, we think the better.
I think there's been sort of a realization that while water is abundant in Wisconsin, and for the most part, there's enough water to meet our daily needs for residential uses, business uses, I think there's a realization that it's not unlimited and that there is a cost to using water, either from pumping and treating the water like we had talked about, or on the wastewater treatment side as well. And so, and more, there's been an awareness that water has an intrinsic value in the environment as well. And so I think people are starting to think about how they use water, and they want to reduce their water use for a number of reasons.
A critical part of the Great Lakes Compact is the concept of water conservation and managing our water so that it remains a resource for our communities for generations to come.
I think we have to do it. The economy depends on water, on good, clean, healthy, fresh water, and an ample supply of it. So conservation is simply a wise investment in our own future and in our own options. Conservation doesn't have to be draconian, it just has to be smart. And as you look at other parts of our country, people in the Southwest know a whole lot more and practice a whole lot more water conservation than we do here in the Midwest.
I think there's a lot of things that people can do to sort of promote a more water efficient lifestyle without really changing their behaviors a whole lot. They're very easy things to do. Those that do live in older homes, I think one of the biggest water losers in the home is a leaking toilet. And even a silent leak in a toilet can waste 100 gallons a day or more. And you add that up over the course of the year, and that's a lot of water, particularly in communities like Milwaukee, where there's a lot of maybe older homes, leaking faucets as well. I think being conscious about how you use water outdoors is also important. Watering your lawn at the appropriate time, not during the middle of the day, so the water is just evaporating in the heat of the summer. And then there's always as technology improves, appliances are improving. High-efficiency clothes washers now use 75% less water. Incorporated with that is the energy reduction, that you don't have to heat that water, and so it's really a water and energy conserving device. Same with dishwashers that are more high efficient. So I think for the average homeowner, it feels like I can't do a whole lot. What can I do to make a difference? But really every little bit helps, and by making some of these small changes, they all add up and result in real water savings.
The most recent part of the conservation program that we have implemented was we've changed our rate structure for how we charge people for water. Typically, as you use more water, the price of the water goes down. Now, for residential class customers, what we've done is we've reversed that. The more water you use, the more you pay for that water. And we're the first utility within the state that has taken on that task of implementing those types of rates.
But what you should think about is thinking of water in a whole sense, that if you pump it from someplace, it's going to come from another, and there will be an effect. And so you should always try to support land use planning that includes water. That's a big problem. We don't include water issues in land use planning. We decide how we're going to put in housing units or Walmart stores or whatever based on a whole variety of constraints, but water is never one of them. If we could get that into our thinking as a society at large, I think we would be a long way towards solving our problems.
Well, I think water utilities in general are in an education process right now also. We're learning what conservation all means and how it can benefit us also. And so we're traveling along this learning curve along with the governors as they implement this Great Lakes Compact. And we're trying to develop our water supplies and water resources in the most environmentally friendly manner.
I don't think anybody would openly say they're opposed to conserving water. You know, it's one of those apple pie in America good behavior things. We all want to conserve. I think the challenge is we want somebody else to conserve so that we can have our ample supply without a lot of restrictions. What we're looking for are people who are willing to be leaders, and increasingly we're seeing folks who are doing really creative things in terms of water conservation in industrial plants, water conservation in agriculture, and I think it's only smart and it's only savvy to become, in a sense, a global leader in water conservation strategies, and then we can export the strategies and the technology, as well as benefit our own region's economy and the quality of life here. So conservation just makes good economic sense, good social sense, and in a global economy, good entrepreneurial sense.
Yeah, I think people in this country have historically viewed water supply as being there free for the taking. If there's water beneath you to pump, go ahead and pump it. If there's water in the stream or the lake, take it. That's not a habit that we can keep up anymore. We have too big of a population, and when you take water from a water system, it has effects, and so we need to begin to think of water as coming from someplace. So if I pump a lot of water from an aquifer, perhaps a stream will go dry in the fall when there's not much water in it, or the local lake might have a lowered level.
If I had one thing I could tell everybody, this is our best and maybe last chance in building strong protections for our Great Lakes going forward into the future. If we don't act now, it's going to become harder and harder to pass anything strong out of Congress or out of the Great Lakes states. And so we need to work together as a region to act boldly to protect these Great Lakes that are so precious to us.
If we continue to make progress and really address the significant challenge to the Great Lakes, then the opportunities are immense. We could sustain not only our current population and our current economy, but we could expand it, and expand it significantly if we do it reasonably. So this would be a place that people would want to come and live and raise their families, and they would have the opportunity to do it because they wouldn't have to worry about water.
It's the same thing. We're all in the same boat. We're all drinking out of the same tap, essentially. And if we don't take action, this is my feeling at least, if we don't take action with the Great Lakes Compact Agreement, then there are some very thirsty people outside this region who are going to put pressure on. And we need to put in a legal framework in which we can deal with those issues. We got to have an answer to those. We can't just say, no, you can't have it. That's not an answer.